Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Monday Daylight Savings Time. Everybody's a little bit off as a result, but hopefully will spark your attention given the topic today. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all and our guest speaker to the Berman Institute bi-weekly seminar today. As you see on the slide behind me, we're lucky to welcome David Jones, who's the A. Bernard Ackerman Professor of Culture of Medicine at Harvard University. He's trained as both a physician, you can see on his slide, in psychiatry, and his PhD's in history of science. So he's got a really interesting background, and he'll be talking today about innovators and unintended consequences. I should say before welcoming David to start that we also have a co-sponsor today, which is from the School of Public Health, the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis. So thank you for that. Welcome, David. We're really pleased to have you here at Hopkins and the Berman Institute, and we look forward to your talk. Per our usual practice, David plans to go about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation to come down. We were just comparing notes about bioethics institutes here versus at Harvard Medical School. It's always fascinating to hear the common obstacles that these entities face and the different kinds of solutions they have for improving things going forward. So it's always good to be able to compare notes with colleagues at similar institutions. Now, as any of you have seen over the course of your careers or your personal lives, technological innovation in healthcare or any place else can be really complicated. There are certainly countless examples of triumphs of medical research over the past century. New medicines, new surgeries developed over the past 100 years have clearly saved millions of lives and improved countless others. So even though I will be critical in some respects of the healthcare practice over the 20th century, I don't want to lose sight of that point, that these technologies have the capability for fundamental transformation of human lives. But as is well known, many of these innovations and new treatments often have unintended side effects. New technologies often require difficult decisions between risk and benefit. And in one of the classic studies for historians of medicine, Martin Pernick at the University of Michigan examined a surprising moment in the history of medicine. When anesthetic agents were introduced for surgery in the mid-19th century, many surgeons were initially skeptical of this new technology. Now, anesthesia seems obviously appealing to many of us who would want to have surgery without anesthesia. But at the time, there was a serious debate among surgeons and patients and other physicians. But was it worth introducing this new risk, these were relatively unknown, untested agents, into medicine merely for the purpose of relieving pain of patients during surgery? Would you really take an unknown risk of death simply for pain relief during surgery? And Pernick called this the complicated trade-offs that these people made the calculus of suffering. Now, to do that calculus well, you need to have very good information about both risk and benefit. And one of the problems that I'll be describing today is that in the early years of any new technology, you often do not have that good information of risk and benefit, especially of risk. And I am interested in understanding why this happens. Specifically, the failure of researchers in many cases to characterize the risks of new therapeutic innovations. There's often an asymmetry in their early history where more is known about benefit than is about risk. As I will explain, that causes a fundamental problem for medical decision making. And there are countless examples of this. Chemotherapy agents began to be used widely in the 1950s and again have significantly improved the lives of many people with cancer. But only in the 2000s, 50 years later, did physicians take seriously a problem that patients had long complained about. It's a problem called chemo fog or chemo brain, this sense that people's brains were not functioning as well after chemotherapy as they had been previously. Physicians traditionally had dismissed this as an illusion or had said that it's just in your head, it's not a real effect. And only decades into the use of these new drugs was this taken seriously. There is much excitement today about the promise of probiotics and how control of our intestinal flora has the potential to transform everything, diabetes, depression, many other diseases. But one recent review found that almost none of the studies about probiotics either measured or reported the adverse effects of these new therapeutic agents. Today I want to look at one important episode in the history of cardiac therapeutics, in which perfectly predictable adverse effects were initially ignored and then minimized or dismissed: the cerebral complications of coronary artery bypass grafting. And I'll make three arguments about why this is a problem of interest for ethics. One is about informed consent, the other about how to achieve optimal patient outcomes, and the third about the stewardship of healthcare resources. And then if I have time, I'll briefly describe 4 other related cases in cardiac therapeutics that raise similar issues. And then, in an effort to be a self-reflective historian, conclude with some remarks about the possible adverse effects of this kind of historical research. It's been suggested to me by neurologists, cardiologists, and cardiac surgeons that my work has the potential to do harm. I'm sort of surprised and interested in those arguments, and I'll try to explain how that has happened. So since the very emergence of modern surgery in the late 19th century, surgeons were interested in whether or not they could operate on the heart. The problem that had been realized was if you stop the heart or open the heart to try to fix it surgically, the patient will die. If you're going to do cardiac surgery, you need some technique to maintain the circulation of blood through the body and the oxygenation of that blood during the surgery. And so there was this dream that you'd invent a device in the late 19th century that would do that. And it took a long time to bring these dreams to fruition. It was only in the 1950s, with the work of researchers at many sites in Boston and Philadelphia, and especially in Minnesota, that led to the advent of the modern heart-lung machine. Now, many of the pioneers of this technology, John Kirkland was one of the most famous ones who developed the first really functional heart-lung machine at the Mayo Clinic, were quite optimistic about the safety of these devices. As Kirkland wrote in 1958, properly conducted open intracardiac surgery utilizing extracorporeal circulation has no discernible adverse effect on the brain. Now, very few other surgeons shared this faith. People knew from the outset, in part based on extensive animal research, that these devices were dangerous. No matter how good the technology was, they were going to be an imperfect substitution for the function of a healthy heart and healthy lungs. And they recognized the various kinds of threats that these machines introduce to the human body. They introduced the brain to variable blood pressure, because when you're running the blood circulation through this machine, the machine is responsible for maintaining blood pressure, and it turns out that's quite hard to do well. Even if you had very perfect technique, there's always the risk of introducing air bubbles into the circulation, and if you have air bubbles in your vasculature, it can cause a wide range of catastrophic problems. And then because surgical procedures themselves were complicated processes, they also realized that a wide variety of other micro and macro emboli would get into the circuits of this extracorporeal circulation and produce emboli that would then be found throughout the patient's bodies. Fat, lint, plastics, all sorts of particles were ending up in the bloodstream and lodging in various parts of the body. And then also, as you manipulated the heart, the aorta, the other great vessels, in order to get the person onto these machines, you would inevitably manipulate the heart and these vessels in ways that would often displace thrombi or displace calcifications. And again, these would enter the bloodstream and cause problems wherever they lodged. And people realized that of all the organs in the body that would be susceptible to this kind of damage, it was the brain where this damage would become most visible. Even if you lose a small piece of brain tissue, if it happens to be the wrong piece of tissue, it can have catastrophic effects for a person. So Dwight Harkin, who was a pioneering cardiologist in Boston, wrote in 1955 that a compromise will obviously have to be made between the protection of the brain and the maintenance of the cardiac circulation. There was a clear trade-off that these machines were going to require. And these fears were realized right away. If you read the cardiac surgery literature in the 1950s and 1960s, in the first decade of open heart surgery, they are full of reports of patients who are devastated by brain injury that were a result of open heart surgery. Some patients suffered massive brain injuries during the operation itself and never woke up. They would stop the anesthesia, and the patient would never respond. Others survived the surgery and woke up, but developed psychosis, seizures, or strokes. Still others seemed intact initially, only later to recognize or to have their spouses recognize subtle changes in memory, concentration, and personality. As New York neurologist Fred Plum wrote in 1964, the neurological complications of cardiac surgery are perhaps the single most worrisome aspect of this surgical problem. Now, there was nothing abstract or subtle about these cerebral complications of open heart surgery. During surgery, surgeons and anesthesiologists would record brain activity with electroencephalograms, and you could see the EEG tracing go flat in patients who experienced massive brain injury during surgery. Once they developed ultrasound technology, they would put ultrasound probes on the carotid arteries that would chirp each time an emboli passed the carotid arteries en route to the brain. And you could hear the steady chirps of these devices all the way through the surgery. By one count, millions of particles would pass through the carotid circulation into the brain over the course of a 2-hour operation. If patients died, either during the surgery or soon after the surgery, you could perform post-mortem exams, and they would find emboli and other evidence of brain damage during autopsy. If a patient survived, you could document the changes in the brain with neuroimaging technologies that eventually became available, or with comprehensive neuropsychological testing that you could use to characterize the various deficits experienced by these patients. All of these techniques together served to make the problem visible and knowable. The dangers, the cerebral dangers of open heart surgery were a concrete physical reality. And there was nothing secret about this. The estimates were high. They varied between 7% in some series, as high as 70%, 70% in other series. Surgeons understood that the cerebral complications were a major challenge of this new technology. And doctors, it wasn't just surgeons, but neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists were involved in this research, published reviews in major journals. So in 1965, the New England Journal of Medicine published one major review on the psychiatric complications of cardiac surgery, and another major review on the neurological complications. And the knowledge wasn't confined to the medical literature. It also broke into the public forum in different ways. Rachel Mackenzie, who was a fiction editor for The New Yorker, had to have open heart surgery, had a horrendous postoperative course with months in and out of delirium. She wrote up her experience in The New Yorker, and then this was published as a best-selling book in the early 1970s. And the language that these researchers used to characterize the problem reveals the seriousness with which they saw it. They would write about cerebral suffering, cerebral injury, or brain damage. They believed they understood that brains were harmed in a direct physical way by these techniques of cardiopulmonary bypass. Now, surgeons worked very hard to improve their techniques of valve repair and congenital heart disease, and they worked very hard to make these technologies safer. So it's certainly the case that by the 1960s, the complication rates, as well as the case fatality rate for cardiac surgery, had fallen substantially from where it had been 10 years earlier in the 1950s. But the complication rates were still substantial. All surgeons working in cardiac surgery in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s would have been very familiar with this problem. They would have spent the previous decade operating on patients with valve disease and congenital heart disease. They would have all experienced these complications in their patients. Everyone was aware. But then an amazing and a surprising thing happens. In 1968, there's a long prehistory, but in 1968, cardiac surgeons published the first accepted case series of an operation that would transform the field of cardiac surgery. Coronary artery bypass grafting, or often called CABG for short. There was tremendous enthusiasm about this procedure, in part because the population of people who might benefit from this procedure was huge, millions of patients in the United States. It was seen as opening up a vast new market for cardiac surgery. And also because it seemed that the benefit of this procedure was obviously effective. As Donald Effler, who was chair of cardiac surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, which was the site that really pioneered this technology in the late 60s, as he wrote, arteriographic proof that the pathological ligature has been removed effectively and myocardial perfusion has been restored is prima facie evidence that the needs of this particular individual have been met. And so it was quite clear to the surgeon that if the problem was an obstruction in the coronary artery, if you could surgically place a graft to bypass that obstruction, you have solved the problem. No reason to think more about it. Their early studies did a lot to try to characterize the efficacy of this procedure, showing that basically in all patients it relieved angina pectoris. And they did pay attention to some aspects of safety, especially operative mortality rates, which was one of the key measures they used to compete against surgeons at different centers, the risk of intraoperative myocardial infarction, and also the graft patency rate. So what percentage of these bypass grafts actually had blood flowing through them 1 week, 1 month, 6 months, 1 year after surgery. And yet, as CABG launched in the late 60s and 1970s, no one, at least initially, studied the cerebral complications of this procedure. Now, I looked at the first 200 reports published about bypass grafting between 1968 and 1973. Nearly all of them described the desired effects of this procedure. Relief of angina, blood flowing through these grafts. Some of them would describe potential side effects, heart attacks, non-cardiac complications. But even though the neurological damage was mentioned in some, it was usually just as a listing of causes of death. So they'll say in a series of 1,000 patients, 20 of these patients died, 5 from heart attacks, 2 from stroke, 1 from brain death. So it was often just mentioned in passing. Of the first 200, only 4 articles made more than a passing mention to the cerebral complications of cardiac surgery. Even though every surgeon doing this procedure had decades of experience showing that this was a substantial risk faced by the procedure. Evidence of the risks emerged very slowly. Some surgeons hoped that coronary artery bypass grafting would be safer than valve surgery or congenital heart disease surgery because it didn't involve opening the chambers of the heart. The coronary arteries run along the surface of the heart, so in theory you could get in and out, never open up the chambers. But it did require, for the most part, certainly by the mid-1970s, using heart-lung machines. And as neurologists at Mayo Clinic recognized, although the risk of air embolism is much less during bypass operations, other pathogenetic mechanisms implicated in the production of cerebral symptoms during open heart surgery, i.e. hypotension, hypothermia, hypoxia, microembolization, etc., are equally operational during bypass surgery. So even though bypass surgery compared to valve surgery did remove one risk, the risk of opening the cardiac chamber, most of the other risks were there. When I've asked neurologists and surgeons why so few studies were done early on, many of them said the problem was that it would just be hard to do all of these hard to do these studies. If you estimate that the CABG had a stroke rate of 5%, in order to produce a study that would have 20 strokes, which would be a very small number for analysis, you'd have to have the study of hundreds of cardiac surgery patients. This is not easy to do. There were very few centers that had those kinds of operative volumes. There was also lack of consensus about what was the best way to measure these kinds of outcomes. I don't know if any of you have been involved in neuropsychological testing, but it is incredibly complicated and often very idiosyncratic, with different psychologists recommending different batteries of tests to characterize a problem. Cleveland Clinic in the 1970s didn't have a neuropsychologist on staff, so there was no one who could do these tests. So there were a variety of reasons why it was hard to do these studies. And another issue is that the researchers had other priorities. Surgeons were focused on proving the efficacy of this procedure and competing with each other to see who had the best outcomes on the largest case series. And as the neurologists told me, they were much more interested in developing their own treatments for disease like stroke, myasthenia, anything else, than they were in documenting the complications of some group of surgeons. That just is not high-value research from the point of view of neurologists in the 1970s. This was a cover from the Cleveland Clinic magazine from fall 1986, celebrating the collaboration between the cardiac surgeons and the neurologists, the heart and the brain, the scarecrow and the tin man. That's fall 1986, 20 years into the history of coronary artery bypass grafting at the Cleveland Clinic. It took a very long time for the clinic to establish this kind of robust collaboration. There was no oversight of this kind of surgical innovation by the FDA. No one was looking at complication rates and saying you can or can't do this surgery based on that. And one of the things that puzzles me the most in some way is that neither journal editors nor reviewers, nor the many critics of this procedure, demanded data on neurological outcomes. If you were the editor of a surgical journal, you could easily have said, I'm not going to publish your case series of 5,000 patients unless you produce the data on neurological complications. But as far as I can tell, no editors ever said that, because if you look at the first 200 publications, neurological complications are almost never discussed. So no one was holding the surgeons accountable, at least in the first decade of this procedure. The first serious studies aren't published until the 1980s, first coming out of Cleveland Clinic for a variety of reasons, and when they were published, they understood that this was likely an underestimate. Because one thing people had realized over the decades of doing this work is the complication rate you report depends on how hard you look for complications. And so if you do a chart review of discharge summaries written by surgeons, you will almost never see mentions of patients having strokes. if you look in the nursing notes of these same files, you will see lots of symptoms that sure sound like these patients were having strokes that the surgeons just weren't noting. And then if you look at patients who had neurological or psychiatric consults, you'll find all sorts of things, because if you do thorough exams on postoperative patients, you can find a lot of neuropsychiatric pathology. And so they had assumed that the 6% estimate was an underestimate. And they also recognized a concerning age trend. If you were under 50, your risk of having open heart surgery without measurable brain damage were pretty good. But by the time you got to age 70 or above, the complication rates are increasing dramatically. And this was a time in which the average age of patients having open heart surgery was increasing dramatically. And so more and more the patients were actually in the high risk end of this curve. Now, despite all this knowledge, the literature in cardiac surgery tended to downplay the problem and discount the risk. And so this is a table, it's going to be too small for you to read most of this, of some of my favorite quotations that I have found in the literature. You'll find people saying that even though we have been studying this for 40 years, the problem is still not well understood, which both wasn't true, and the assumption, the implication was if it's not understood, we don't need to worry about it. Surgeons would say, look, the only reason we're worrying about such subtle problems as cognitive change or stroke is because we've gotten so good as surgeons that our operative mortality rates are low. So the fact that you're worried about complications is actually a celebration of the success of surgical progress. Other people would write that all these emboli weren't a problem because the brain can withstand a persistent bombardment of emboli during surgery. Now, indeed, that was true. 95% of these patients who were having all of these emboli entering their brain didn't have measurable problems after the fact, and that is a mystery of brain function. How can it absorb so much damage without showing the damage? The brain continues to be a mysterious place. And then the other one that would often come up a lot is that surgeons would say the deficits detected on neuropsych testing aren't a problem for patients in their real life because the activities of daily life are much less taxing than neuropsychiatric testing. So even though there is the damage, the patients won't be aware of it, so there's no reason to be concerned. I'm particularly interested in three different ways, three different rhetorics of minimization that you see in this literature. One is language. One of the longest series of studies was done by a group in the neurology department here at Hopkins, did major work, long-term prospective studies in the 1990s, 2000s. One of the things that they were to do was to rebrand the problem. Instead of referring it to brain damage, as had been done in the 70s and 80s, they referred to it as cognitive change. Another aspect that comes up a lot is victim blaming. Now, when cardiac surgery got going in the 1950s, American psychiatry was still very firmly under the sway of Freudian psychoanalysis. They saw delirium experienced by these patients as a form of post-operative maladjustment. So the classic explanation that they told was that many of these patients coming to surgery had been cardiac cripples who had lived a life of chronic disability because of their heart disease, and they had used that disability in a neurotic way to avoid adult responsibilities. The surgical cure provided by the surgeons took away this shield and forced them to re-engage with all the adult responsibilities. In the setting of this, they would break down. One woman, for instance, developed psychotic rage towards her husband, and the psychiatrist was not surprised. As he wrote, it was apparent that the patient was very disturbed by the prospect of giving up heart disease, which had provided her a somewhat acceptable means for satisfying her dependency needs, and, in addition, a way of avoiding the more mature but anxiety-provoking sexual role in life. And it was this conflict that this woman was now medically cleared to have sex with her husband that had led to the psychotic decompensation. Now, it's very easy to make fun of these 1950s psychiatrists. They produce a lot of material which is very colorful along these lines. But this kind of victim blaming has persisted deep into the modern era. Colleagues of mine at Harvard Medical School have been interested in the genetic susceptibility of brain injury. The observation here is that some people get brain injury after cardiac surgery, but most do not. So of course there must be some genetic basis for this discrepancy because geneticists will say there's a genetic basis for everything. So they looked at 40,000 markers in 42 patients and found a set of inherent differences between the people who were at risk and those who were not at risk of brain injury after cardiac surgery, suggesting that the problem is not the surgery per se, but the genetic liabilities that these patients bring into the operating room. So that's where the responsibility for these complications sits. Or this group at Hopkins produced what is genuinely a surprising finding. If you look at the bottom two lines here, these two here, those compare 5-year cognitive outcomes in people with severe coronary disease who had bypass grafting and people with severe coronary disease who did not have bypass grafting. And as you can see, those two lines are quite close and quite parallel. Their conclusion from this prospective study has been that the 5-year neurological outcomes are no worse in patients who had surgery than the non-operated controls. And so from their point of view, the fact that 5 years after surgery you see neurological deficits in a lot of these patients has nothing to do with the surgery, but is all about the patients themselves. These are all vasculopaths, people who have bad vascular disease. If you have bad vascular disease in your heart, you have bad vascular disease in your brain. If you look at any of them 5 years later, the brain's going to be worse off than it was at the outset. As they wrote in 2012, patient-related risk factors, such as the extent of pre-existing cerebral vascular and systemic vascular disease, have a greater effect on both short and long-term neurological outcomes than do operative variables. 74% of the risk could be attributed to patient characteristics. Now again, this is a robust finding. This is probably the best study of this problem that has been done. It's not randomized, there's subtle issues. It's a very good study. But it's a hugely surprising result because for the past 40 years, people have been carefully documenting the very concrete, specific ways in which the brain was damaged by this operation. So it's very hard to understand how their study does not show that effect. And then the third way in which this minimization happens is that people often exaggerate the benefits of surgery. So in 2001, Duke Medical School published a big study showing a high rate of essentially dementia in patients 5 years after surgery. Time magazine ran an article essentially downplaying the significance of that finding. It says, yes, there is a risk of stroke, so why would anyone have this surgery despite the risk of stroke? Time magazine says it's better than dying. Now the implication here is that these cardiac operations are truly life-saving operations, and you're faced with a choice of life or death. And if that's the choice, then life with a slightly smaller IQ might be something you would choose over death. But the question is, well, in what percentage of these patients getting this operation is it truly a life-saving operation? And the answer is not that many. So again, you'd exaggerate the benefit in order to minimize the risk. Now again, to credit the surgeons, this is an area of ongoing and substantial quality improvement. The techniques of open heart surgery are 1,000,000 times better now than they were now 70 years ago when they got going. The Society of Thoracic Surgeons should be applauded for leading efforts to improve the safety and efficacy of this procedure. You can make the case that coronary artery bypass grafting is the best studied and best optimized surgical procedure that exists in American medicine today, and I think that's probably actually a robust claim. They have done stupendous work on this procedure. And yet problems persist. If you look at the most recent data, they still say there's a 2 to 4% risk of stroke, which is the same stroke rate that was recorded in the 1970s. So then you can say, well, if there's been stupendous progress, how come the stroke rate has been stable for 30 years? My best explanation of this is that it's an equilibrium phenomena. As the safety has improved, surgeons have operated on higher risk patients, and that has balanced out the effects. Now you're doing safer surgery, higher risk patients, you end up with the same outcome. I don't think anyone is consciously targeting a 2 to 4% stroke rate, but it's almost as if they think that's the acceptable level. And as that drops, then you could operate on sicker patients in order to maintain this 3% threshold, which has been stable now for 40 years. So given this history, what are the questions that it raises of interest to ethicists and historians? So one is informed consent. This is an account by a patient who was Denton Cooley's first CABG patient. So Denton Cooley, some of you may know, was a towering figure in American cardiac surgery, protege and then rival of Michael DeBakey, founded the Texas Heart Institute, one of the most successful cardiac surgeons in the US in the 20th century. This is what happened when Cooley decided in 1968 to perform his first bypass procedure. Dr. Cooley walked in the room, pulled out a scratch pad, drew me a picture, and said, "This is what I'm going to do," like he did them every day. I had no idea I was his first bypass patient. Now, this patient is telling this story 10 years after the fact. Patients are notoriously inaccurate in reporting after the fact what kind of consent conversations take place. We don't know what Cooley actually said to Austin the day of. But it seems plausible, at least, that Cooley did not have an extended conversation with this patient about the risks and benefits or the cerebral complications of coronary artery bypass grafting at the time he did this informed consent. And there's very interesting literature about this issue in cardiac surgery. If you fast forward 40 years, you find yourself, if you were a conscientious cardiac surgeon, in an extremely difficult and puzzling situation. Given the literature that has now been produced over the past 50 years, you could have two completely different evidence-based consent conversations with your patients. One surgeon could say, bypass grafting, like other forms of open heart surgery, carries a risk of stroke up to 14%, delirium up to 32%, and many other neurological and psychological complications. And you could produce a long literature to defend that position. You could also say, CABG is quite safe with a low risk of stroke, 1.4%, and rates of long-term cognitive decline that are no worse than in non-operated controls, and cite the Hopkins Neurology Department. So both of those claims are evidence-based, and raises this question: if you are the cardiac surgeon, which conversation do you have with the patients? Now, in theory, you ought to be able to say, well, which evidence is the best evidence? There should be a way to discern which of those is actually the more realistic vision of the world. That's extremely difficult to do. Related question is, well, what are the decisions that will lead to the ideal patient outcomes? Now, there's increasing evidence in many domains of medicine that patients often regret the therapeutic decisions that they make after the fact. Many patients and families, again, after the fact, wish they had not tried aggressive chemotherapy. This is certainly the case. My father died of pancreatic cancer a few years ago. He wanted to try, he was hopeful, and like so many cancer patients, he spent the last 4 years of his life in misery from chemotherapy side effects that had no discernible impact on his life expectancy. And many patients feel that bind. There are many spouses of patients who have had cardiac surgery who, again, second guess the decision. Yes, the cardiac surgery, the valve replacement or whatever it was, improved. It's usually their husband's exercise capacity in some way, but the damage to his memory, his personality, what else, does not justify the gain and function that the surgery provided. Well, why does this happen? Why is it that there are many patients who regret the decisions that they've made? Part of the problem is that both the knowledge base itself and then what physicians do with it often downplays risk when decisions are made. And this skews decision-making in the direction of intervention. So if you're ever faced with a clinical decision in which you have comprehensive knowledge of expected benefits and very partial knowledge of the expected adverse effects, that's always going to skew the balance to make the procedure look more worthwhile and push people in the direction of intervention. Now again, I'm not saying that the surgeons or the cardiologists are actively manipulating the consent conversations. I'm sure that does happen in some cases. This is a more fundamental problem. We have better knowledge of efficacy than we do have of side effects. So even if you are just doing neutral arbitration of the knowledge that exists, you're still going to replicate this skew in the informed consent conversations you have with patients, leading to overuse. Studies have now been done by groups like the Informed Medical Decision-Making Foundation, which is a healthcare think tank up in Boston, that if doctors do a more thorough job with the consent process, patients tend to be much less aggressive in their therapeutic decision-making than they are with businesses as usual. So if you make clear not simply what the hoped-for outcomes of intervention are, but what the realistic outcomes of intervention, including both the likely benefits and the likely side effects, patients are much less likely to decide to pursue this therapeutic intervention, whether it's in cancer, chemotherapy, or many other areas of healthcare. And then the third related issue is this issue of stewardship of healthcare resources. Coronary revascularization at Hopkins or at Harvard or anyplace else is a massive industry. There are many academic medical centers, at least as of 5 years ago, it may have slipped slightly, but as of 5 years ago, where fully 1/3 of their revenue comes from the combination of coronary angiography, coronary angioplasty, and coronary artery bypass grafting, including some of the hospitals here in Baltimore. So it's a massive sector of the US healthcare system. Since the 1970s, since the earliest days of cardiac surgery and then from the earliest days of angioplasty in the 1980s, there have been accusations of overuse of these technologies. The surgeons and cardiologists, whether motivated by hope, whether motivated by financial conflict of interest, whether motivated by something else, have overused these technologies. And it's really easy to imagine how this problem of the mismatch in our knowledge between benefit and risk can contribute to this. If mostly what you see is how great these procedures are without seeing similar knowledge of their adverse effects, of course that's going to push you in the direction of intervention, and that will then lead potentially to overuse of these technologies. If we had better knowledge, and if we had better consent, that would lead to more appropriate use of these procedures, and that would likely bring down healthcare costs. Now, I've run through this material very quickly. If people want more thorough documentation about this, about these claims, don't hesitate to contact me or check a book which covers some of this. But let me run through these 4 cases quickly for comparison so you can see that this isn't just an issue of the artifact, or the historical artifact of CABG. So first case, in the 1990s, as evidence of the cerebral complications of coronary surgery became more widespread, surgeons did the obvious thing, which was to develop techniques of off-pump coronary artery bypass grafting, what they call OPCAB. The idea is if you can do coronary artery surgery without putting the patient on a heart-lung machine, then you, in theory, have wiped out this batch of complications. Makes perfect sense. Turns out doing an off-pump CABG requires considerable dexterity, and it's helpful to have some devices to help stabilize the heart as you do this. But it is, in fact, possible to suture grafts into place onto the surface of a beating heart and spare the patient the heart-lung machine. As a group of prominent surgeons at the University of Western Ontario wrote, with beating heart surgery, avoidance of the embolic potential associated with the aortic cannulation and decannulation and of the generation of microgaseous and microparticulate emboli from the pump circuitry would be expected to significantly decrease cerebral embolic load and improve outcomes. It makes absolutely perfect sense. Became a wildly popular idea in the 1990s, a huge area of investment by tech companies. Medtronic and others produced these cardiac stabilizers to enable beating heart surgery. You'll see reports, not to say that the New Yorker is a perfect source of medical information, but Jerome Groopman published a profile of surgeons at Boston's Beth Israel Hospital, interviewed a fellow from the surgical intensive care unit who said, these patients after beating heart surgery look great. He has no pump head at all. That was the surgeon's lingo for the neurological complications. No pump head at all. These guys come up after beating heart surgery as clear as a bell. And so you can find all these reports in the late 1990s. Surgeons published dozens, if not scores, of case series about how wonderful this technique is. No strokes, no cognitive dysfunction, nothing, beautiful outcomes. But then, as is so often the case, eventually the randomized clinical trials were published, 10 to 20 years into the history of this technology. And sure enough, the randomized clinical trials did not confirm the wonderful results of off-pump coronary artery bypass grafting. This was one of the largest studies published in the New England Journal a few years ago. This is the key curve here. As you see, those lines basically do not diverge at all. For some reason, the editors allowed them to publish a blow-up of that. And so if you totally explode the vertical axis of those lines, you can see that they're different. They're not significantly different. I don't know why the journal allowed them to play that visual trick. But no difference in neurological outcomes off-pump or on-pump. Again, it makes no sense whatsoever, but it was a very robust finding, and this has been repeated by all of the randomized clinical trials that have been done. So what's going on? The results are genuinely puzzling. Given that we believe and have shown that heart-lung machines introduce risk, removing the machines should reduce the risk. One theory is the effect is real, but the trials are underpowered. Comes up a lot. Another theory is that the effect is real, but the trials were compromised by study design or surgeon skill. So the surgeons who were using these cardiac stabilizers weren't experienced enough. And so if better surgeons had done the studies, you would have seen the true value of off-pump CABG to be revealed. Some people said the effect is real, but ambiguities in neuropsych testing have obscured the outcomes. And the one that I think is actually most commonly accepted now is that the effect is real. Removing the heart-lung machine does reduce one category of risk, but beating heart surgery itself imposes a different set of risks. To get to the arteries on the backside of the heart, you have to flip the heart up in a certain way. The heart is still beating, but you have torqued the base of the heart and the aorta, and that is, they think, fracturing the calcifications on the inner lining of the aorta and producing its own embolic load, even as you spare the patient the heart-lung machine. Enthusiasm for off-pump CABG, which was growing quickly in the United States, has now cooled. Most medical centers are about 25% of cases. The situation is very different in other parts of the world. In India, where I've also done work, about 100% of coronary artery bypass grafting is done on a beating heart. And there are very interesting reasons for why that is. Case 2. In 1970s, intensive care physicians recognized the value of heart-lung machine technology and adapted it for a new use, short-term life support with people with acute pulmonary failure, so ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. First used in 1972 to save the life of a man who had shock lung after being hit by a car. They had to fly in the heart-lung machine from another hospital to set it up in the ICU to perform ECMO on this guy. He recovered, but only after a mysterious 3-week period where he slowly lost consciousness and then regained consciousness. So it was a significant neurological event during his recovery. The authors wrote that they had no ready explanation for the neurological trajectory, despite the fact that by 1972 there was 15 years of data on the neurological complications of heart-lung machines. They didn't somehow transfer that knowledge to this new domain of ECMO. And over the past 40 years, this has persisted. There has been extensive use of ECMO, especially in neonatal intensive care, but increasingly in adult intensive care. And there's been essentially no substantial study of the neurological complications of ECMO, even though they should be 100% the same as the neurological complications of open heart surgery. And in fact, even worse. With open heart surgery, they had realized if you were on the pump for less than 2 hours, you were in pretty good shape, but every hour past 2 hours, your risk increased. People will often be on ECMO for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, really substantial risk of injury from this. This was a major review a few years ago. It did report complication rates, but as they wrote, the long-term effects of ECMO, especially potential neuropsychiatric effects, require further investigation. Serious studies just have not been done. So a very interesting case of the effects were well characterized with this device in a different domain. That knowledge hasn't been brought over into the new domain, and studies haven't been done. Now, I don't want to suggest that this problem is unique to devices, surgeons, the device industry. The problem of late detection of complications happens in many other domains of medicine. The story of rofecoxib Vioxx is probably the most famous case where knowledge of the mortality of this drug was not noticed or was actively suppressed, depending on where you come down on the judgments of Merck, until very late in the game. A researcher in Boston, Jerry Avorn, has argued for the year that Vioxx was on the market was likely the single leading cause of heart attacks in the United States. Some people dispute that claim, but again, significant problem, delayed recognition. You can also see it if you look forward. So there's a lot of excitement about stem cell therapies in all areas of medicine, especially in cardiology. The idea is if someone has a heart attack and they have a myocardial scar, all you need to do is inject stem cells into that scar. They will repopulate the scar, reconstitute functional heart muscle, and you will live happily ever after as if you hadn't had a heart attack. Now, you don't have to be an electrophysiologist to wonder, well, if you reconstitute all this heart tissue, are the electrical networks in the heart going to work just as well as they do in your naturally developed heart? The short answer is no, they're not. Every study that has been done of electrically active cells in cultures shows that they generate their own internal electrical rhythms, which is fine and kind of interesting if it's in vitro in a laboratory, but you really don't want tissue with its own electrical rhythm either in your heart or your brain. They will often acknowledge that this technology has a risk of arrhythmias. And so you'll see this time and time again. In addition to heterogeneity of cardiac cells produced from stem cell administration and their random implementation are likely to cause cardiac arrhythmias. As if that's like a curiosity statement. Cardiac arrhythmias can be lethal. This is not a minor problem. I had a long conversation the other day with someone who worked in the cardiac stem cell lab at Harvard. They are all very aware of this, but are just ignoring it for the time being. They're so far from clinical use, they're just trying to develop this clinical new technology. The assumption seeming to be they'll be able to figure out the details down the road. There's no way around this. You cannot establish a native electrical system by implanting stem cells into it. Now, I want to finish with some reflections on doing history. When I presented some of this work a number of years ago at History of Medicine meetings in Cleveland, ground zero for coronary bypass grafting, there were some neurologists and cardiologists in the audience. One asked if I had any idea how hard it would be for clinical researchers to do the kind of comprehensive assessments of patient outcomes that I was calling for as a historian. He said, doing comprehensive neuropsych exams on every surgery patient is simply not feasible. It was fine for me as a historian to set the bar high, but completely unrealistic. And again, I'm partially sympathetic to that claim. When I presented later work, not so much focused on the neurological complications, but on the overuse argument, I've been furiously critiqued by interventional cardiologists who obviously have a lot of vested interest in this. I've been accused of being dishonest, of misrepresenting the history. They say that only people who have actually consented a patient for angioplasty have a right to engage in a conversation about consent for angioplasty. Essentially, I should stay in my lane. Historians have no right to comment on clinical practice. I was quite flummoxed at the time, and he and I couldn't even agree on basic historical facts. There have been accusations of overuse. I'm not making that up. Cardiologists accused other cardiologists of overuse. There have been accusations and prosecutions and convictions of financial conflict of interest. I'm not making this up as a historian. These are things that happened. At this time, 2004, I was completely flummoxed by his inability to see the same facts. I had, in retrospect, this was a more innocent time in American political discourse. Now I would have the language to discuss this. I had facts, he had alternate facts. There was no way to bridge that. Third case, and this is the one that's most puzzling for me. I've been critiqued by an angry cardiac surgeon from Mass General Hospital. And he said, look, I am accusing surgeons of having done something wrong in the 1970s for having failed to study the cerebral complications of bypass grafting. He said, if patients hear this now, they will conclude, I should not trust surgeons. Or they will misunderstand the history. I'm talking about the 70s, he knows I'm talking about the 70s, but a casual reader might not realize and might think I'm critiquing how surgeons are operating today. And this will discourage patients from pursuing life-saving treatments. His argument, which he'll admit, is that historians should not critique any bit of the past that is relevant to the present. It's fine to critique bloodletting, but stay away from cardiac surgery. Now, of course, this isn't an ethic that any historian would accept, especially the many of us who want to make history relevant for contemporary policy. But it does leave a serious dilemma for which I don't think there is a good answer. I think it is essential for historians to take a critical look at the history of medicine, especially the aspects of history of medicine that are relevant for practice today. But I do worry that this does have the inevitable impact of decreasing trust in the medical profession. If we critique, a reasonable audience would say, well, then we shouldn't trust. And I don't know the way forward, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Really interesting and provocative. So, time for some questions. We will ask you to wait for the microphone to come to you so that we can capture your question on tape. Alexis.
Hi, I'm Alexis Walker. I'm a fellow at the Berman Institute. And so you raised this really important issue around stewardship of healthcare resources. And when you were first introducing the case series, the CABG case series from the late 60s, you use this language of opening a vast new market. And I'm wondering if that's language that was used in the cases, or at least the framework, the position of sort of industry and health, I would say, has shifted significantly in the period, and I would imagine that that would have played an interesting role in this history.
Yeah, so I'd have to search. You can do the search more easily now than you could have 10 years ago. Does the word market appear? I don't think so, but it's certainly the case that surgeons would write explicitly about how the potential for this new operation is enormous. There are millions of people who have coronary arteries, potentially all of whom could benefit from this procedure. You will see people like Donald Leffler at Cleveland Clinic writing about how he was a total cash cow for the Cleveland Clinic because of the way their salary structure works. I don't know what his salary was, but it was capped at 5 figures. So he was at least, at most, $99,000 a year. At a time when his surgeon's fees were about $1 million a year. So the Cleveland Clinic was making a vast amount of money off him. He was aware and unhappy. Meanwhile, people like Cooley, who were doing, because of the way their fellows were set up, 10 procedures a day with a surgeon's fee of $10,000 per case. His income, because he made a mistake in oil speculation, declared bankruptcy, all of this is known. His income in 1986 was $9.8 million, which is pretty good for an American physician at that time. The language of markets has been much more explicit in the world of angioplasty and devices.
Jeremy, green in the back.
Thanks, David. I really enjoyed the talk, and it's been a pleasure watching how your engagement with ethics has evolved over time over the course of this project, and even the after effects of this project is getting at the end. The question I have right now is most clearly related to the final cardiac surgeon objection at this point. Well, what's the point of history? Sure, we understand now that we've had these problems of ignorance in the past, but they have been resolved now. and even on some level denying the lesson of learning from what was not known in the past, thinking about what was not known in the present. So the question I have is an extension of this, which is, I can imagine a number of people answering you that, well, not only is it not a problem with the present, but in the present we can learn more effectively about risks now because of big data, because of AI, because of the automation of certain epidemiological processes and looking for risks through electronic medical records. A kind of a panacea, a very hopeful option there. How do you answer those questions that the problems of the past can simply be solved by these new technologies?
Yeah, the first thing you said, I think, is part of the response to this. You can say, well, since we're in the business talking about comparative risk, which is a bigger risk? Acknowledging the past misdeeds of physicians or ignoring the past misdeeds of physicians. I think historians can make a very strong case that ignoring it is worse than popularizing it and then dealing with the aftermath. But part of the reason the surgeon was so unhappy is because he was involved in setting up the Society for Thoracic Surgery registry, which he sees as the key innovation for the reason that you described. Not all, but most cardiac procedures now done in the US funnel into this registry. He will say this gives us the ability to ascertain complications, and we are so much better off now going forward. Basically, we've done this great thing and you're ruining it, and so you really shouldn't do what you're doing. But again, I would say, well, the history again has a valuable role. How confident are they that the registry actually is capturing all these effects? The registry relies on self-reported data by the surgeons who are doing the procedures. As history shows, there's a vast amount of evidence that surgeons don't recognize and underreport the registry. So the registry must undercall the complication rate. Now, people will say, well, the future is online electronic medical records, EMR. An electronic medical record doesn't matter what the surgeon says. If the person shows up at their internist 6 months later and the spouse says, my husband doesn't have a sense of humor anymore, I'm not sure if you can do that on a template for most electronic medical records, but there is other ways for this stuff to get ascertained. I don't think it's ever going to be a panacea, and I think it's important to use this kind of historical knowledge to be aware of the ways in which it's not going to be a panacea, or what the risks are to our current systems of complication ascertainment, so that we can make them better.
Thanks so much. I'm a pediatrician and a palliative medicine physician, so I don't do cardiac surgery of any kind. But I do work with some children and families who've had that happen. And I'm overwhelmed with all the information you've taught me about that I consider to be evidence. It's certainly historical, but I think this goes way beyond what I would think of as history with a lowercase h. I'm commenting because I'm struggling with informed consent, which I also have a very high regard for, and which, when I'm the physician doing that, takes a long time to be sure I'm saying everything and it's understood and so on and so on. And I'm thoughtful about something I hear in our hospital now called, I think it's called ECPR, which I think means CPR, and you call it activate ECMO in case you need to cannulate this child immediately. And not only is there no consent about CPR, but there's no consent about ECMO, I assume. I don't know because I'm not the one doing it, but I'm thoughtful about how, then there's the, are we looking at the late outcomes and so forth to even have information, but how do we balance the ethics of, we have to make an emergency intervention here and we think this is going to help, so we're going to do it, with when do we pause or know when to pause, or do we have some time for conversation somewhere in the middle of that?
Yes, those are all very important questions. I think pediatricians struggle with these more explicitly than people in adult intensive care units. And one of the things that's interesting about ECMO, and that complicates the comparison I made, bypass surgery for some set of patients is an elective procedure. You're choosing whether or not to do it. That gives you much more time. As I said in response to the Time Magazine article, it's usually not a life-saving intervention. And so in the setting of an elective procedure to remove chest pain, the neurological complications then loom large. ECMO, in theory, is really done in life or death situations. The medical team really believes that the patient is going to die unless this is done. And in that setting, then a 5% risk of losing IQ points feels very different than it would be. So it's not a choice of IQ versus angina, it's a choice of IQ versus not continuing to survive. And so that makes it a much more difficult decision. And then, as you said, it's often happening in the heat of a moment. There's not time for long conversations. Neonatologists often do this well because they often have a bit of the luxury of a few-day window, like when a woman goes into preterm labor at 22 weeks. As long as the labor is not precipitous, they can often have extended conversations with the family before the delivery actually happens. But there they will say the problem is that a conversation 4 days before delivery is very different than what actually happens in the delivery room. Parents will decide not to do anything. The child is born, cries. The minute they hear the cry, everything flips and they want everything possible done. And then you get in a situation of how do you reassess and undo a decision that has been made? And I think pediatric ICU people are getting better about doing that and saying, okay, we did this in the emergent setting. Let's catch our breaths and see if this is worth going forward. But it's very hard to discontinue something that has already started.
One more. Yes, Deb was.
Yeah, going back to your point about the pushback that you got about this opening up this wound again or whatever. I wonder if you did frame it as, this is surgical innovation, it usually happens without sort of a ton of transparency because it's happening in individual situations. What can we learn from the past about what are the outcomes patients care about and how we might be able to structure data collection for new things, not these things that have this bad history, but for new things, how can we structure things better for the next innovation so that we don't have these bad outcomes?
So my sense is that people are more self-conscious of that now than they were 10 or certainly 40 years ago. It is a fundamental challenge for two different ways. So one is, part of the reason it's easy to measure efficacy is you know what you want the procedure to do. And so you can define a set of outcomes around that pretty well to find out if you've done that. You don't know what unexpected side effects a procedure is going to have. And so there are certain things that you wouldn't know to measure a priori. There's a lot of where, with expected side effects, like all the CABG innovators ought to have known that putting people on the pump, they were going to have this risk. That's a different issue. But a lot of times, that's an unknown risk. I don't think there was any reason why Merck ought to have expected that rofecoxib would increase cardiac mortality. It just doesn't make sense. It was an accidental and serious finding, which they may have covered up. I don't want to totally let them off the hook. So the question of how do you do it? There's been movement recently, both in terms of research and also outcome studies of patient-centered outcomes. How do you characterize what really matters to the patients? And there's a pretty clear sense that what matters to patients is different than what matters to physicians. And if you do truly patient-centered outcomes, you might be able to improve the value of clinical research. Again, it's really hard to do well. I'm sympathetic to the neurologists that said, we just can't do comprehensive neuropsych testing on every patient pre-op and post-op to figure out what these interventions have done. I mean, you could send ethnographers out into patients' daily lives to study every aspect of this. And there was a very interesting study that was done, different piece of this project, at Beth Israel Hospital in the 1930s and 1940s. They were doing thyroidectomies to prevent coronary disease. So removing thyroid glands completely, putting all of their patients into mixed edema in order to control thyroid. They were very aware that this had a big impact on patients' lives, so they enlisted the help of the social work department. Again, this is a very progressive research group, to send the social workers out into the community to try to characterize every aspect of this intervention on the patient's work, their lives, their relationships, their community engagement, and everything else. So it is possible to do that kind of work, but it just requires massive investments of resources. As Jeremy had suggested, there's hope that a lot of this will become available passively through big data. I'm sure you could do a study looking at social media postings of people after bypass surgery to see if they have an impoverished vocabulary afterwards. I mean, I don't know if anyone's done that. It'd be trivial to do given the technology that exists. That'd be great. I don't think it's going to solve all the problems. And there also you can get these funny cases where sometimes, and this goes back to physician paternalism, there are outcomes that are really important that patients don't value. Again, a lot of patients really don't care whether their blood pressure is 150 over 135. Well, physicians now do care about that. And so what do you do if the outcomes that matter to physicians aren't the outcomes that matter to patients? You don't want to go too far with a focus on patient-centered outcomes. Somehow you need to measure everything. I just don't know how you can do that.
Thank we have to end with that. Thank you so much.